Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this last installment of our Beethoven series here at the Cornell Center for Historical Keyboards. Our Beethoven series ran from last fall, 2019, into this semester, last fall, 2020, until 2021. And it is my absolute pleasure here to introduce our very own director, Annette Richards, professor of music, Given Foundation Professor of the Humanities, and of course, university organist. And through this conversation, we'll get to know Annette's work more intimately, how she integrates performance and scholarship in a unique way that's very much a feature of the Cornell Music Department until today. Just a little bit about what we do here with this event. The impetus came up originally when one of Zach Bierken's graduate students in applied mathematics, in fact, wanted to do a program about that connected late Beethoven keyboard music with the keyboard music of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. And of course, that is an area of Annette's research interest. And so I thought I would contribute with Opus 101, Beethoven Sonata, which features in Annette's first book from 2001, which we will talk about today. And of course, the intention always was to have this conversation with Annette to talk about her book and connections between the visual arts, music aesthetics in the 18th century, and the music of late Beethoven. So there's a little sub-series within the larger Beethoven series, and I would urge everybody to visit our website and to look through the early events to which this one is connected, and of course to check out the book, which will be the subject of today. So Annette, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It's very nice to see you.
Yes, so maybe just to get things started, might you tell us a little bit about the inception of this project that resulted in this book from 2001?
Yeah, absolutely. It became, I would say it was a serendipitous, in fact, the way this came about. I was planning to write a PhD dissertation on late 16th, early 17th century Italian keyboard music. And I was fascinated by a group of Neapolitan keyboard composers, especially who were interested in what one might think of as extreme chromaticism and a kind of fantastical style that somehow was outside the parameters of a kind of, normal music in some ways. And I've always been very interested in playing that music. So I had an idea, this was what I was going to write a dissertation on, but at the same time, I was becoming very, very interested in playing the clavichord and very interested in C.P.E. Bach's music. And almost as a hobby, I was reading around that music. And I started to think about the ways in which people talk about fantasy and improvisation. Yes. In 18th century music. And I began to, so there was a sort of a relation between this, I've always had this kind of interest in what one might think of as the grotesque and the sort of things that somehow spill out of the frame, yes. Things that can't quite be contained, things that demand a certain sort of investment on the part of the performer and a certain kind of engagement on the part of the listener too.
Yes.
And so I started to think more carefully about C.P. Bach's fantasies, especially, which also I couldn't really find a good critical literature on, good musicological literature. And this is a moment when we're all reading Charles Rosen's brilliant The Classical Style. We're all thinking very carefully about sonata form and. Yes. And the fantasy is a kind of unform and an ungenre. Yes. And I'm thinking, well, how did people in the period talk about this music? And at that point, I stumbled really quite accidentally on one of the descriptions that I talk about in the book, in late 18th century German, music criticism, making this analogy between listening to fantasies and walking through landscapes.
Yes.
And that really caught my eye, and I wanted to learn more about that. And essentially, from this kind of hobbyistic, if you like, interest in the clavichord and in C.P. Bach's fantasies, I will say that my roommate at the time, now husband, David Yearsley, was already really beautifully playing these fantasies. So I had the experience of both trying to do it myself and hearing him play them, and also he's a great improviser. So these many ideas, came together, and I thought, you know what, I want to pursue this more carefully. And at that point, I became really immersed in the kind of garden culture, landscape garden culture of the 18th century, and in this incredibly rich critical literature about the fantasy.
Yes.
And that's really where the project took off. And then in the end, I wrote a PhD dissertation on that, and that eventually turned into that book.
Well, that's interesting for me to know. I mean, I didn't really know this more personal backstory. I mean, this aesthetic category of the picturesque, which is the kind of angle or the analogy. I mean, it just, coming back to your book in preparation for today, it just seems to me it taps into so many core questions about not just improvisation, but, of course, the relationship between improvisation and composition, temporality. I mean, having preform ideas, being in the moment and projecting into the past. I mean, it taps into so much of not just musical experience, but experience of art forms, other kinds of art forms. And maybe one way to start thinking about it is the question of temporality. One thing which I think sometimes you allude to, because you make the analogy between walking through these English gardens and, of course, all the debates at the time about different, let's say, French Baroque gardens versus, the more kind of formalistic, and then the freer or make-believe free English gardens. Was there a sense when people were designing these gardens that there was a sequence that one would go through, that predetermined sequence for the visitor? Because it seems to me your music, even if it's improvised, I mean, time just goes linearly, and there's nothing we can do about that. So if you catch a listener for a 10-minute improvisation, there is an inexorable sense of beginning through end.
I think the answer to that is yes and no. And in a way, that's where it gets kind of interesting from the musical perspective. Yes, there was, in the sense that many of the more elaborate gardens were designed with sort of programs in mind, and there were designated paths and routes through these landscape parks, if you like, that would take you from through contrasting areas and give you contrasting experiences. So you might start off in a kind of open pastoral landscape, might feel a little bit like a meadow. You would follow the path down and around, and it would take you down into a dark, shadowy, grotto-like area. You might then, so yes, there was definitely these parks were designed with a trajectory, and not just the sort of about the immediate thing that you would experience, but also, very importantly, the route would allow you to experience things in the distance as well. So it's not just a question of going from the shade into the sun, but actually having moments when suddenly a vista opens up.
Yes.
And these moments of kind of sudden surprise, or turning the corner and seeing something in the distance that you hadn't known was there before, is very much part of the plan. So there's a plan. And indeed, guidebooks were written, and guides were written to tell people how to go through these gardens. And many of them, it's not just an experience of sort of nature, but it's also often a very textual, literary experience. You're going to come across inscriptions all the way through the garden. There's funny little fake tombs with inscriptions on them. You might pass a little chapel with an inscription, so it's literary as well. But you're not always necessarily confined to one particular route. So
Right.
there's always room to go off the path, to take a bit more time, to turn around. You know, the trajectory is less specifically defined, and that's where, you know, what you describe, it is different then from a piece of music, because we're experiencing a piece of music because you, the visitor to the garden, are pretty much in control of how long you take to go through, which way you turn to look, you know, whether you turn back for a moment, whether you actually take some little path off, you know, whether you alter the route.
That's right.
In a way that you aren't really able to do when you're sitting listening to somebody, you know, making a performance.
Right. So the visitor, I mean, it's a little bit like one of those make your own adventure novels that one reads as a kid. You have a certain flexibility in being the actor or enacting the story yourself, because you can choose.
Yes.
Now I'm gonna, you know, or even just the pacing of your stroll.
Yes. Mike, can I just step back one moment? I don't want to I do want to interrupt you, because I just want to say one thing that I had forgotten to say before, which I think is important, is that what we're talking about too is a particular an experience which is designed to be an aesthetic experience. In other words, this is an experience sort of designed within a framework that's been articulated by the middle of the 18th century that opposes, on one hand, the beautiful, and on the other, the sublime.
Yes.
And so you have this very well theorized notion of what beauty is and how you experience it. It's generally smooth, it's calming, it's rounded and undulating, as opposed to the sublime, which is rugged and terrifying. And you know, so these two, and the difference there too is that, of course, the beautiful is experienced in some sense passively. You just kind of lay back and you love it, whereas the sublime is a much more kind of active engagement. And the picturesque, you know, these landscapes actually sort of mediate between those two experiences. So that's, you know, again, so it's an aesthetic experience as much as a kind of immediate enjoyment. It's actually, you know, more complex in some ways.
Right. And you know, because so much of your book is about going back and forth between these analogies, and one of your points is sort of the perspective of the subject, and it's a very kind of active, right, as opposed to the beautiful, which, you know, you're just sort of in a more passive receiving mode. I mean, what we're saying just now, the visitor is both receiving and engaging in creating that aesthetic experience. I mean, of course, there's a blueprint that's laid out, that's available there to be engaged with. So, you know, I'm just thinking about these subjects and how that kind of maps onto the musical actors. I mean, we have composer, we have, you know, the script being, say, the composition itself, and we have the performer. And sometimes, of course, in the 18th century, 18th and 19th century, these are the composer and the performer, especially in an improvisation context, they're one of the same person. And then, of course, the listener. So when we sort of then map that onto the picturesque experience, or the landscape experience, I mean, there's the designer of the garden, the architect, or the grand manipulator of these experiences, if you would, and then what you call sort of the text. I mean, the garden itself can be read as a text. And as you just said, you know, there are literal inscriptions or things that invite, but there is no sort of performer in that sense. I mean, I guess in what we're just saying, the visitor doubles in that role, and whereas in music, you know, assuming the composer and the performer are different people, there is a kind of intermediary person who then takes you on that tour, I guess, and then there's the listener who's then being taken. Does that make sense to you? I'm just trying to think carefully about these important subjects and agents involved.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's where it's important to it's important not to to some degree, the very direct analogy breaks down there, because the musical, the question of performance is complicated in a way that the experience of the garden is less so. I mean, one could argue there are other agents in the creation of the garden. Of course, there's actually the gardener. I mean, there are the people who in fact make the thing. And there's also, you know, the strange aspect that in some sense, the garden itself is some kind of agent, because it is changing all the time. And I mean, this is also interesting. If you imagine the people who make these, I mean, they were talking about great parks, who make them, they have to make them with a sense of what the thing is going to be like in 50 years time, when those trees have really grown up, you know. So there's this very strange kind of way in which the garden itself is sort of an agent. But I think you're absolutely right. There are definitely some quite significant differences across the art forms there, even though both of them play out in time in interesting ways, or are experienced in time. Maybe the sort of in between the garden and the musical sort of object work event, one might think of you know, where the literary analogy comes in here too. And I think that's an interesting one, because you've got an author, and you've got a reader, I guess, but often there are often things in the middle. There's narrators that, you know, there's somehow a narrator who's not necessarily or you know, and there's again there's a reader who is performing to some degree, you know. So there's they're quite complex sort of networks of actors, I think, both in the literary example and in the garden one. And I think if we, you know, it makes me think about the musical you know, that kind of cluster of agents in the musical world as being a little bit more muddy and networky than just this simple composer over here,
that's right,
listener here, performer in the middle.
I mean, in the literary sense, you know, especially if it's a stage work, a theatrical work, then you have actors involved. I mean, I guess that's a still closer analogy to music. But that's very interesting how actually the text for a landscape garden is itself very much alive. I mean, I hadn't thought, you know, of course, that it has a literal life of its own that it's evolving. And I mean, perhaps that is one reason why, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me the impression from the book, from what I understand about the picturesque, is, you know, the cultural position of the composer is quite different from a garden designer in that sense. I mean, the garden designer, I mean, maybe that is also why, because the garden itself takes on a life of its own. So you don't always just feel, oh, I'm going through the garden design by so and so, whereas, you know, we're in no doubt that we're hearing a piece by Beethoven or by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and no one else.
This, you know, gets into very interesting questions, which we perhaps won't get into too deeply here, but very interesting questions of authorship and ownership. And it's no coincidence that it's right at this moment in the sort of late 18th century when we start to get issues of, you know, notions of copyright for artworks. You can't really copyright a garden, and you can't, in the same way that, you know, buildings too. I mean, you know, the garden is essentially landscape architects, or what we're talking about, and the status of the landscape architect and the architect. I mean, they can be significant named, you know, figures, you know, well-known famous figures in aristocratic circles. Obviously, there's a great deal of status associated with being able to create a landscape park. But no, very different types of cultural figure than, you know, famous composers or writers.
Right. Now, going back a little bit to, because I would love to come back to Opus 101, which I worked very hard to put out a few weeks ago.
It's beautiful performance, Mike. Amazing performance.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. So coming back to that, because you talk about, you know, of course, Beethoven is the feature of the last chapter of your book, and kind of there's a big chunk on 101, and of course you talk about anchored with that famous recall of the opening of the first movement in the third movement or the intro to the finale, really. And of course, in musical terms, I mean, everyone who has, and you cite Carol Berger and others who talk about this, I mean, of course, it's grounded in musical time. So we hear the first movement first, and then the third movement later. And so it's almost always framed as a kind of recall of memory or recollection. And bringing in the picturesque actually enlivens an aspect of the music that I kind of intuitively felt, but wasn't able to really articulate. And that is sort of the spatial aspects of the picturesque. So my feeling, and I was inspired by your book, is that imagining, you know, going through a landscape garden, you come across a similar or the same type of scenery.
Mm-hmm.
And you're in no doubt that you had seen that earlier. So there isn't that much of a temporal disorientation, but there could be a spatial one, like say in the maze where you're disoriented in terms, is this the same spot or is this a different spot? And of course, as we just said, the visitor then has the option of maybe I'll turn right or turn left, or where I go from that same spot. So what I'm trying to get at is that there's always a sense to me in which the return of the first theme in the third movement, you know, after the chord, then Beethoven says, you know, take off the una coda one by one. There's a sense in which I always feel that actually is the origin for the piece, because the fourth movement is the sonata movement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the first movement is so floating. I mean, harmonically, you're never really in the tonic. You don't really know where you are. Compared with the fourth movement, it's hard to say that that's a formalized sonata movement. I mean, the fourth is the kind of landing point. And of course, then this material gets fulfilled motivically. So so, in other words, that material, that upbeat, fulfills itself in the fugue material of the finale, more so than the first movie when it just sort of meanders and develops on its own. So, in some abstract sense, I've always felt that actually that is the origin of the piece, and the first movement actually is something else. So, if we take away the linear temporality, and with the picturesque, you can introduce a kind of circularity from the spatial metaphor. You can rethink what the origin of the musical work is. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the very beginning of the piece.
Yeah, you know what, I mean, yes, I absolutely agree with what you say, and I mean, just to reiterate what you're right, that the critical, what generally people think about this moment is, yes, reminiscence. It's looking back, that moment. And you're quite right that when you actually, what it sounds like, if it actually, you get it sounds like a sort of you have a little slow introduction. It sounds like how a piece ought to start, a proper beginning.
Yes.
I mean, so it definitely has this uncanny quality of beginningness, even though it's right in the middle of the piece, or kind of comes late. And of course, we've heard it before. So there's recognition, disorientation. What is this doing here? And yet you're absolutely right. It's a beautiful idea that it's as if you stumbled upon the notion that origin does not have to be related to time, that it can have a kind of out of time essence. And maybe another way to think about that is an image that Beethoven's contemporaries used. I think I talk about it a little bit in that chapter too, of not so much circularity. So this idea that somehow you've arrived here and you came from there, and there's but a spiral. So that you may be at this point on the spiral, and there's a point that looks the same, that's somewhere else in the spiral, but it's not a line. So you're not from here looking back there, but it's actually going in a different kind of trajectory. And that shape, which comes out of time, it makes me think a little bit about that sense, again, to use the garden, the sort of landscape garden experience. I think too, it's a little bit these moments, maybe it can also be a sense that it's not as if you started in one spot, but you started at a spot where you could see something beautiful in the distance. And there's actually something about that first movement, which is so, it's almost distant, the way again, that floatiness, it's almost as if you see that temple on a hill in the distance from the beginning of the walk, then you head off in these various directions, you keep it in your sights for a while, and then you're somewhere else in the park, and then this is when you come back to it. It's not, you don't even necessarily need to have arrived at it at that moment later on. It's that you see it again.
Yes.
So again, it's like catching a glimpse.
Yes.
And as you say, it creates this amazing sense of distance and space, as opposed to an
purely
experience
linear.
In time.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
yeah.
No, I mean, that's why I was just astonished again, how, I mean, both how kind of richly available the notion of the picturesque can be, and of course, in your book you bring so much richness to it.
Mike, can I ask you something? I mean,
yes.
what I really was thinking about, and I'm obviously still very interested in, is the experience of listening to this music and the experience of playing it. This is where I'm interested in improvisation, because improvisation, the player and the listener are kind of collapsed one onto the other, especially if it's improvisation for yourself. But for my sense is that why I think what I was trying to do in drawing attention to this aesthetic category of the picturesque was precisely to not necessarily to point to the way that you can think about this music in visual terms, because this kind of analogy with landscapes and the way they look, but actually thinking of the picturesque, and again, people in the period talk about this not so much as a visual category, despite its name, but one about experiences of disruption, irregularity, surprise, ways of experiencing artworks that don't conform to a kind of beautiful, sort of structural, rational model. And so it's it's both a kind of pictorial mode in a way, but it's much more than that. It's much more this experience of disruption. And I wanted to ask you whether sometimes I felt, as I was writing this book, and of course my main focus for the first part of the thing was on C.P.E. Bach, because his style is so imbued with these moments of discontinuity. The degree to which sometimes I felt, this is just I hear this music this way, and I kind of am interested in playing it this way. Is this just very subjective, or do you, as a performer who knows this music very well, feel that this is actually a kind of coherent and useful way as a performer to think about moments of disruption and interruption? I mean, we talked in the Beethoven the Beethoven is very much a question of return and this kind of strange, dislocated moment of repetition that one needs to kind of explain in some way. But in C.P. Bach, we're often talking about just really strange things that are kind of shocking and surprising.
Well, I would say it's not, I mean, as you said, it's not only necessary to think about these tensions between, I mean, where the boundaries are. I mean, it's absolutely imperative. I mean, my analogy was C.P. Bach fantasy type works, or I mean the fantasy element in his music in general, is to envision the analogy with acting. I mean, not that I'm a trained actor, but I can absolutely imagine that, imagine your favorite movie stage scene where the actor himself is shocked at what happens next. The character is shocked, so the actor himself has to be shocked. But of course, the actor himself knew all along what was going to happen to him, and to create that for the audience time and time again, to have the craft every day. Or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm on Broadway, 8 p.m. I'm going to recreate that, and that craft, I think, is what I think a lot about when I approach music of this sort. And you have to just gauge it perfectly, because of course there is a kind of plot being unfolded. You have to be in control of that. I mean, I suppose for musical performer, you have to be both the actor and the director, all at the same time. I mean, maybe the kind of overall arch is relegated to the director, but I think it absolutely, I mean, it gets at the picturesque, as you said, is more than just the pictorial. It gets at the heart of the process.
Right.
Of what's needed.
Yes, and I wanted to, when you talk about the actor, if we think of C.P. Bach, and I suppose Beethoven too, who of course, grew up on C.P. Bach's essay on the true art of keyboard playing, and obviously knew C.P. Bach's music very well. The kind of the paradox that these kind of complicated and strange and surprising moments in C.P. Bach, or the actor communicating to his audience, is communicating to a number of different types of audience member at the same time. And that I think is interesting too. I mean, you get to this question of connoisseurs and amateurs, that term that you hear so often associated with C.P. Bach, of course, is 6, great collections of sonatas, rondos, fantasies. That's where he first publishes his fantasies for connoisseurs and amateurs. And the sense that, that different types of listeners who have to be actively listening will respond in different ways and hear different things, so that you've got the listeners who are just blown away by the sudden moment from loud to soft, or the sudden kind of change of direction that they don't necessarily understand, but they get the sense of surprise. If they're listening carefully, they sort of have a sense it should go, the feeling is interrupted. And then you have the connoisseurs who absolutely know that what C.P. Bach did, or I think this is Beethoven analogous too, that they realized that actually what he did was he used a diminished seventh chord, and he headed off in a direction that is perfectly logical, but missed out the connection in between. So it sounds absolutely extraordinary, but actually there's a kind of a connection, so that you've got amateurs listening in one way, you've got expert listeners hearing the craft in the process.
That's right.
And it's a fascinating engagement with this engagement with the moment of performance, the sort of understanding that this is a moment, and requiring your listener to actually go with you, be ready to be surprised, be ready to weep if the moment seems to require it. So that's another thing that I think is so interesting in this music and in the picturesque, especially because it's about this experiencing with the performer, the composer performer, in real time, these moments which may be highly artificial, highly rehearsed, previously planned, but sound absolutely spontaneous and completely of the moment. So that's
I mean, what you're saying, I think, is that the many layers of production and reception. I mean, of course, there's the layer of the immediate surface, the disruptive surface, and then, of course, once you've dig deeper or you think more, if you achieve connoisseur status, then you realize that the deeper underlying continuities of the craftsmanship, how things are weaved together. And it's incredible to think, I mean, of course, publication back then takes the place of, say, recorded music nowadays, where we can listen to the same performance over and over again and kind of achieve our own connoisseur status by re-examining a work or a performance that seemed totally spontaneous, but we want to understand, peer behind the veil, as it were. And I suppose that could be a reason why, these compositions became popular as publications, because people then want to have it and then be able to go back and forth and experience and enact it themselves.
And I mean, that again gets back to another of the sort of very interesting points of intersection with this 18th century aesthetics of the landscape garden, because it's precisely at that moment that you've got improvisations which are, especially free fantasies, so free improvisations are clearly not free improvisations because they've been published, and yet they mimic the freedom and the spontaneity and the naturalness in very interesting ways, in exactly the same way that the landscape garden, of course, appeared to be a natural landscape, as opposed to the French formal garden, and yet was, of course, very, very carefully designed and a product of the ultimate artifice. So again, that sort of art nature problematic and kind of paradox plays out, in both of those areas in interesting ways. And that too, I think, is one of the reasons why contemporaries, late 18th century writers, especially in Germany, found this this analogy with the landscape garden so useful to talk about this kind of musical game with illusion, with deception, this sort of way in which music that is playing with the listener. And actually that also gets us in some ways to Haydn, I think, and the idea of musical humor, which works in some ways the same way. I mean, this kind of surprising interruption, strange repetitions, unmotivated moves to odd keys, funny use of silence, that too is part of the same story.
And it's interesting too how the reception through history, I mean, from the 18th century until now, emphasize different parts of this continuum that is captured by the picturesque. I mean, somebody like Rosen then would say, well, Haydn's interruptions are justified because you can always find this underlying connection and thread, whereas perhaps for him it's C.P. Bach's these interruptions for him are not motivated by a clear underlying, but one could easily flip the argument upside down and say, well, but C.P. Bach then is a greater master at this because you can't find this underlying thread, that the immediate experience continues vibrantly so 200 years and more of listening, and it defies still to this day the reduction.
I think that is exactly right. And of course, I mean, Bach himself said, oh, and this is what improvisations are. You do this and you go from here to here, and he lays it out and it is coherent. And then he goes, but then what you do is you just try to hide he calls it's a process of rational deception. You try to hide all the stuff in between. So you make it sound as incoherent as possible, essentially, but the connoisseurs will know, and everyone else will just be surprised at how amazing it is that you can traverse these very wide distances, essentially, and unveil these beautiful landscapes in this virtuosic way. But what was I going to say? Yes, I wanted to just go back to the question you asked right at the beginning, Mike, which was about sort of how did this project come about? And the other aspect, the other thing that I really sort of wanted to do here was to think about the ways in which C.P. Bach's music, especially, and I think one could also say Beethoven, the way in which that music is performed. And I have often felt a certain dissatisfaction with many performances of the late music, the rondos and
yes.
fantasies, especially the late sonatas, rondos and fantasies, precisely because the instinct, or of naturally the instinct of most performers is to try to make sense out of what they're doing. So when there's a sudden shocking stop to a phrase, the temptation is to round it off and make it beautiful, and to kind of create a sense of connection to what comes next. And I began to think, no, that's exactly not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to just stop and then just do something else. That's what it's about. And I think that was what I was trying to find my way to explain as well. That, and again, that I think speaks to what you were talking about, the latter day reception of this music, the sort of the efforts to show that it is in fact coherent. Schenker's another good example, just showing how this is brilliantly coherent music. Well, it is, but that's not really the point.
Right. I mean, it's at the expense of other layers of experience. I think.
Yes, that's right.
One needs to find a way to have one's cake and eat it, and that usually, yeah. Just sort of to close, I wanted to maybe shift to a slightly different direction. I think it is in this last chapter. You mentioned, for instance, in this post-Napoleonic era in Vienna, that there were these debates about how to reframe, I guess, these public gardens. And so the political climate was such that they decided, actually, despite the popularity of English gardens at the end of the 18th century in German-speaking lands, that they were going to opt for the French Baroque because it was easier to keep the populace in check. The English garden was considered a bit unruly, and it invited radical
yeah, there were lots of places to hide.
And so I was thinking again, I mean, making the analogy back to music and back to Beethoven's music, I mean, it strikes me that a lot of Beethoven's political music is also very foursquare. I mean, the first thing that pops into my mind, I mean, the finale of the Fifth Symphony, I mean, it doesn't get more foursquare than that. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about sort of this kind of mapping in terms of music that have an overt political ambition. I know, earlier in our series, we interviewed Nick Matthew, who of course wrote Political Beethoven.
Yeah.
Whether actually in the aesthetic realm of music, that certain rigidity too conveys certain types of political agenda, and then other kinds of music which have this kind of plasticity, 101, maybe lends itself less to certain types of political motivations.
It's a really interesting question. It's absolutely right that in Vienna, especially, that the English style garden was viewed with suspicion and seen as an invitation to radical, bad idea. Munich, on the other hand, had a very famous English garden quite early on that was very public. And of course, the right through the 18th century, in Germany especially, I mean, England had a very particular valence as a place of democracy, and the people had a say, and that was very, very important to people writing about the English garden. One of the aspects of its appeal was because it was very closely associated really early on with this English liberal political realm, as opposed to the Ancien Regime French monarchical thing. It's a very interesting idea that just to take Beethoven as an example, one might map the kind of foursquare political music onto a sort of the notion of a somewhat rigid regime, authoritarian kind of watching over. I probably would have to think carefully about quite how that would work, but I do think that one can think of, it's not an accident that that's public music.
Yes.
And that there's this kind of, straight this kind of looking straight down the alley of this sort of public music that wants to engage a large audience, that, you know, lots of people thinking the same or hearing it the same way. Whereas I think that what categorize, or, you know, really kind of characterizes the fantastical style, if you like, is that it's kind of personal.
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of one-on-one, you know.
Yes.
It's intimate. It opens up the possibility that you might hear something different from the person next to you, and you might hear something different from the person playing. You might hear something different from what the composer wrote. And I mean, maybe the interesting exception here is a piece like the Choral Fantasy, which starts off, of course, with the big sort of improvisation on the piano.
Yep.
I mean, of course, it was Beethoven performed it himself at the end of that famous huge concert with the Fifth and the Sixth Symphonies. 3 hours later, the kind of, but the way that, and of course, it starts off with this big solo. The Fantasy, it starts off with a free improvisation, which be, you know, immediately speaks to this private improvisatory realm. But then it launches, eventually it ends up with this great big choral thing, and you know, it's a preview of the Ninth Symphony essentially. But I think that what's interesting there is that the way Beethoven's contemporaries heard that moment was, as, I mean, I don't want to get this wrong, was the idea that actually that too was an extraordinarily private, it was like this suddenly what had opened up in the improvisation was a window into the very intimate private soul of the genius. It's like you saw this kind of creative genius coming into being, and the idea that not so much Beethoven himself, but Beethoven, the creator, is kind of figured there as emerging out of the kind of private blur of the sort of improvisatory opening, and then suddenly coming into definition with the words and the chorus at the end, as in this kind of invention of the artist. And I think that speaks to how this music, you know, that's a public moment, but it's actually read as the improvisatory part of it is read as a bizarrely intimate,
yes,
private
right,
kind of thing. So I think that the answer, you know, the short answer to your question would be probably the really political stuff is actually designed not to be too ambiguous. The fantastical stuff, the picturesque stuff is all about ambiguity, and probably at that point it's only going to work in these smaller environments where, you know, there's this notion of a kind of private listening, and maybe that also gets us to this kind of newer 19th century way of kind of listening in the dark, listening on your own, listening with your eyes closed, you know, and maybe also being that getting back to the player. Actually, this is where the player, I won't even say performer, you, the pianist, sitting at your piano in your own room, working through, say, the Opus 27 Sonata Quasi una Fantasia, working through that as a kind of intimate, you know, private musical moment. That I think is probably what this sort of picturesque mode is about.
Yes,
so
yes.
It may well be subversive, but it's like a one-on-one subversion rather than something that's going to activate a whole crowd, I think.
Right. No, I
Does that
think
make sense?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. I would agree with that. I mean, having simple harmonies, you catch more people together on the downbeat, literally.
Yeah, exactly. And you can rouse them into some kind of agreement, but that's not really political dissent. Actually, it's probably the opposite. It's probably a great tool for enacting a kind of mainstream authority.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has just been so wonderful for me to come back to your book, and it's been 20 years. It's hard to imagine.
It's been a very long time, but Mike, I would thank you for your amazing performance of this music, and I hope everybody will listen, not only to to all the performances that you've done recently, because it's wonderful to hear this music played with such subtlety and with such intelligence as well. So I put my own plug in for you.
Yes. So anyway, we invite our audience to visit our series, and we'll have that up for a while. And there's Tom Began, there's Nick Matthew, there's a lot of people contributing to the series. So thank you again, Annette.
Thank you, Mike. This has been great.